In the winter of 1838 and 1839, approximately 16,000 Cherokee people were forced to walk over 1,000 miles from their homeland in the southeast to Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. The journey took months. It took them through winter. It took the lives of approximately 4,000 people, roughly 1/4 of those who started the journey. This is the Trail of Tears. It is one of the darkest chapters in American history. It is a story of government betrayal, broken promises, forced migration, starvation, disease, exposure, and death on an almost unimaginable scale. It is a story that should shame every American who believes in justice or humanity. It is a story that reveals what happens when government abandons law for power. It is a story of a nation's government committing what we would now call ethnic cleansing. This is video 22 of Jackson's America, and it is the story of the Trail of Tears, what actually happened when the Cherokee were forced from their homeland. Not the abstract policy discussions, not the legal cases, not the political debates, but the real human suffering, the actual deaths, the families separated, the graves left behind. This is a story about 4,000 people who died. It is a story about what their deaths mean. And it is a story about why we should remember what happened. Before the Trail of Tears, the Cherokee had a homeland. For centuries, the Cherokee had lived in the southeast. They had built communities in what is now Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, and other southeastern states. By the 1830s, the Cherokee had established a civilization. They had homes, they had farms, they had built lives. Some Cherokee lived in simple homes. Some lived in substantial houses. Some were wealthy, some were poor. But they had stability. They had community. They had a place they belonged. The Cherokee had towns and villages. They had government centers. They had gathering places where people came together. They had schools where children were educated. They had places of worship. They had everything that a functioning society needs to exist. Many Cherokee had integrated into the broader southeastern economy. They farmed. Some farmed extensively. They raised livestock. They participated in trade. Some Cherokee owned stores. Some were merchants. Some were professionals, lawyers, doctors, educators.
Some Cherokee owned enslaved people. This is uncomfortable to acknowledge, but it's true. The Cherokee had adopted slavery, which was widespread in the South. Some Cherokee were slaveholders who owned other human beings and extracted labor from them. The Cherokee had families, extended families, households, children growing up knowing their place in the community, elders who had lived their entire lives in this territory, roots that went generations deep. The Cherokee had sacred places, places where they had always gone, places connected to their ancestors, places that held spiritual meaning, places connected to their identity as Cherokee. This was home. This was not a temporary situation. This was not something the Cherokee thought would change. This was where they lived. This was their world. And then the government ordered them to leave. In 1838, the federal government sent soldiers to Cherokee territory with orders to force the Cherokee from their homes and march them west. The Cherokee were given minimal notice. They were told they had to leave. They were told they had to gather what they could carry. They were told they had to prepare to travel. Soldiers came to Cherokee homes. Soldiers forced Cherokee out of their houses. In some cases, soldiers were brutal. In some cases, they were simply efficient. But the result was the same. Cherokee families were separated from their homes. Some Cherokee tried to hide to avoid removal. Some ran. Some resisted. But soldiers were searching. Soldiers were enforcing the removal order. Cherokee were gathered into detention camps. These were not comfortable places. These were holding areas where Cherokee were kept before the journey began. Conditions were poor. Food was inadequate. Sanitation was minimal. People were crowded together. And while they were in these detention camps, white Americans came to Cherokee homes and took things.
They took livestock. They took tools. They took goods. They took anything valuable. It was theft, but there was no law protecting Cherokee. There was no one to stop it. Cherokee watched their homes being taken over. They watched white Americans move into their houses. They watched their livestock being stolen. They watched their property being dismantled and distributed to white people. Imagine that. Imagine being forced to leave your home with soldiers present. Imagine watching white people immediately move in and take your possessions. Imagine knowing you would never return. Imagine the trauma of that. Children were taken from their homes. Parents were separated from children in some cases. Elders were pulled from the places where they had lived their entire lives. Extended families were torn apart by the logistical demands of moving so many people. Some Cherokee died in the detention camps. Disease spread in crowded, unsanitary conditions. People who were weak or sick didn't survive the time in the camps. They died before the journey even began. Some Cherokee escaped. Not many, but some. Some Cherokee managed to evade removal and stayed in the southeast. Some hid. Some fled to other territories. Some found ways to avoid the march. But most, the vast majority, were caught and forced into the journey. The march from the southeast to Indian Territory was over 1,000 miles. 1,000 miles. Not as the crow flies. Actual walking distance through actual terrain. Over mountains, through rivers, across valleys. The journey took approximately 5 to 6 months. 5 to 6 months of walking. Day after day, week after week, month after month. And it was winter. Not the beginning of winter, but deep winter. November, December, January, February, the coldest months. The months with the least daylight. The months with the worst weather. The Cherokee walked in snow. They walked in rain. They walked in freezing temperatures. They walked through ice. They walked through mud. They walked in conditions that were brutally harsh. The clothing available to Cherokee was inadequate. Many Cherokee didn't have warm coats. Many didn't have adequate shoes. Many were wearing what they wore in the summer. Now they were walking in winter in inadequate clothing. The food provided was often inadequate and of poor quality. The Cherokee received rations. The rations were supposed to sustain them on the journey, but the rations were often insufficient, and they were often spoiled. Meat that was rotten, grain that was infested with insects, flour that was moldy. Children and elderly were most vulnerable. Children couldn't walk the full distance every day. Children got tired. Children got sick. Children cried from hunger and cold. Elderly people couldn't maintain the pace. Elderly people had physical ailments. Elderly people got cold more easily. Elderly people needed rest. Pregnant women were walking, giving birth on the trail. What kind of medical care was available for childbirth on a 1,000-mile march in winter? Minimal. What happened to mothers and infants in these conditions? Many died. People got sick. Pneumonia, dysentery, influenza. Disease spread in the crowded conditions. People were walking in close proximity to hundreds of others. Disease spread easily. People who got sick had to keep walking. There was no stopping. There was no rest. There was no medical care. People were expected to keep moving or be left behind. Some Cherokee died on the trail. They collapsed. They couldn't continue. They died of disease. They died of exposure. They died of starvation. They died of despair. Their bodies were buried along the trail. Graves were dug. Sometimes proper burials were possible. Sometimes not. Bodies were left. Bodies were buried in mass graves. The Trail of Tears became literally a trail of graves. Children watched their parents die. Parents watched their children die. Siblings watched siblings die. Elders watched younger people die. And the march continued. There was no stopping for grief. There was no stopping for mourning. The march had to continue. Some estimates suggest that approximately 4,000 Cherokee died on the Trail of Tears. That's roughly 1/4 of those who started. Some estimates suggest the number was even higher.
Think about that. 1/4 of 16,000 people. That's incomprehensible. That's genocide. That's ethnic cleansing. That's what happens when government abandons law and morality for political goals.
History has preserved some accounts from those who experienced the Trail of Tears. These are not abstract numbers. These are real people, real experiences, real suffering. One Cherokee woman was recorded as saying that she saw old people fall along the way, unable to keep up. She said people would stop to help them, but the soldiers would demand they keep moving. So people had to choose, keep moving or be left behind with the elderly. A soldier who was present on the march was recorded as saying that he had never seen such suffering. He said the conditions were inhumane. He said people died every day. He said he knew the Cherokee were being treated badly, but he was following orders. Children were recorded as being so hungry that they would cry, so cold that they would shiver uncontrollably, so tired that they could barely walk. Parents watched their children suffer and could do nothing to stop it. One account describes a river crossing in winter. Cherokee had to wade through cold water. Some didn't make it across. Some drowned. Some collapsed from the cold. The water was freezing. People were dying in the river. Another account describes a mother holding her dead child. Her child had died from disease. She was walking with a dead body because she couldn't leave her child behind. She was walking while grieving. She was walking while carrying her dead child. One elder was recorded as saying that he had lived his entire life in one place. He had never traveled far from his home. Now, at the end of his life, he was forced to travel over 1,000 miles in winter. He survived the journey. He made it to Indian Territory, and then he died, never having fully recovered from the trauma and physical toll of the march. One young person recorded that they didn't know if their entire family would survive. They didn't know if they would see the end of the journey. Every day was uncertain. Every day they faced the possibility that they or family members would die. These are not just stories. These are testimonies. These are records of actual human experiences. These are the Trail of Tears from the perspective of those who lived it. The Trail of Tears happened because the federal government decided to remove the Cherokee. The government passed the Indian Removal Act. The government sent soldiers. The government created the conditions that led to the deaths of 4,000 people. The government knew what it was doing. The government knew that forcing people to walk over 1,000 miles in winter would result in deaths. The government knew that inadequate food and clothing would cause suffering. The government knew that disease would spread in crowded conditions. The government did it anyway. Why? Because Andrew Jackson wanted the Cherokee removed. Jackson had the power to make that happen. Jackson used that power, and thousands of people died as a result. The government told itself a story. The government told itself that removal was necessary. The government told itself that removal was for the Cherokee's own protection. The government told itself that the Cherokee couldn't coexist with white Americans. None of these stories were true. The Cherokee had coexisted with white Americans. They had built a sophisticated government. They had created schools and churches. They had participated in the regional economy. But the government wanted Cherokee land. White Americans wanted Cherokee land. Settlers wanted to move into Cherokee territory. Slaveholders wanted to expand slavery into Cherokee territory. So, the government removed the Cherokee. Despite the Supreme Court ruling against removal, despite the fact that removal violated treaties, despite knowing that removal would cause massive human suffering and death, the government chose political goals over law. The government chose land acquisition over human rights. The government chose expansion over justice. And 4,000 people died as a result. The Cherokee who survived the Trail of Tears arrived in Indian Territory in 1839. They arrived exhausted, they arrived traumatized, they arrived grieving. But they arrived alive. Indian Territory was not Cherokee homeland. It was a new place. It was unfamiliar. But it was where they would have to build their future. The Cherokee immediately began rebuilding. They began establishing new communities. They began constructing new homes. They began planting crops. They began creating new institutions. This is remarkable. After a journey that killed 1/4 of their population, after having their homes taken, after being forced from their homeland, the Cherokee began rebuilding. Within a few years, the Cherokee had re-established their government in Indian Territory. They created a new constitution. They re-established their legislature. They re-established their courts. They re-established their educational system. Some Cherokee went back to school. Some became teachers. Some opened businesses. Some farmed. Some raised livestock. The Cherokee recreated their civilization in a new place. The Cherokee Phoenix newspaper was re-established. Government proceedings were documented. The Cherokee educational system was rebuilt. Within a few years of arrival, the Cherokee had re-established many of the institutions they had in the Southeast.
But the trauma remained. The grief remained. The loss remained. Cherokee people had lost their homeland. They had lost family members. They had lost everything they had built over centuries. Some Cherokee came to hate the Cherokee government leaders who had signed the Treaty of New Echota. Some Cherokee blamed those leaders for the removal. This internal conflict continued for years. But the Cherokee Nation survived, despite removal, despite the Trail of Tears, despite the death of 4,000 people. The Cherokee Nation survived. What does it mean that 4,000 people died on the Trail of Tears? It means 4,000 individual human beings, 4,000 stories, 4,000 families affected, 4,000 deaths. Some of those deaths were children, some were elderly, some were young people in their prime, some were infants, some were people who were sick or disabled before the journey even began. Each death was a tragedy. Each death was someone's loved one. Each death meant that someone lost a family member, someone lost a friend, someone lost a part of their community. And these deaths weren't natural. They weren't from disease that happened to strike. They weren't from accidents that happened to occur. They were deaths caused by government action. They were deaths caused by forced removal. They were deaths caused by inadequate food and clothing and shelter in winter conditions. The government caused these deaths. The government created the conditions that led to these deaths. The government knew the conditions would cause deaths and proceeded anyway. This is genocide. This is what genocide looks like. It's not always death camps. It's not always rapid killing. Sometimes it's forced removal. Sometimes it's inadequate provisions. Sometimes it's forcing people to march in winter conditions, knowing that many will die. The result is the same. A people decimated. A nation traumatized. Thousands dead. And for what? For land. So white Americans could settle Cherokee territory. So slavery could expand. So the government could pursue westward expansion. The Cherokee homeland was taken. Cherokee lives were destroyed. Cherokee Nation was traumatized. All so that American expansion could continue. Today, the Trail of Tears is remembered. There are memorials. There is the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail that marks the actual route the Cherokee walked. There are plaques. There are visitor centers. There are places where people can learn what happened. But many Americans don't know about the Trail of Tears. Many Americans don't know how many people died. Many Americans don't know the specifics of what happened. This is a failure of historical memory. This is a failure to acknowledge what the government did. The Cherokee Nation exists today. Cherokee people are the descendants of those who survived the Trail of Tears and those who avoided removal and stayed in the Southeast. The Cherokee Nation is a sovereign nation recognized by the federal government. So in some sense, the Cherokee were not destroyed. The Cherokee survived. The Cherokee continue as a people. But the Trail of Tears remains a scar on American history. It remains a record of government betrayal. It remains a reminder of what happens when government abandons law and morality. The Trail of Tears should be taught in every school. American children should know what happened. American children should know the names of the Cherokee who died. American children should know the details of the march. American children should know why it happened and who ordered it. This is not ancient history. This is recent history. This happened in 1838 and 1839. This happened not that long ago. And it happened because the government decided that political goals were more important than law, morality, or human life. The Trail of Tears teaches us something fundamental about government. It teaches us that government power without limits
leads to atrocities. Jackson had the power to remove the Cherokee. Jackson used that power. Congress supported removal. The courts didn't stop removal because the president refused to enforce the court decision. There was no check on government power. The Cherokee had no way to prevent their own removal. They had no legal recourse that actually protected them. They had no way to resist a government that had decided to remove them.
This is what unchecked government power looks like. This is what happens when one person or one branch of government can override law and the courts. The Trail of Tears shows us why rights matter, why the rule of law matters, why checks and balances matter, why courts matter, why individual liberty matters. Without these things, government can do what Jackson did. Government can remove people from their homes. Government can force them to walk 1,000 miles in winter. Government can allow thousands to die. And this is not ancient history. Modern governments are capable of the same thing. Governments without checks on power are capable of atrocities. The Trail of Tears should remind us of the importance of limiting government power. It should remind us of the importance of respecting laws. It should remind us of the importance of judicial independence. It should remind us of the importance of protecting rights. The Trail of Tears killed approximately 4,000 people. These were real people, real families, real lives. They died because the government forced them from their homes. They died because the government didn't provide adequate food or clothing. They died because the government marched them over 1,000 miles in winter. The Cherokee who survived built a new nation. The Cherokee today are the descendants of those who survived and those who were never removed. But the Trail of Tears remains a scar on American history. It remains a reminder of government betrayal. It remains a warning about what happens when government power goes unchecked. We should remember the Trail of Tears. We should know the names of those who died. We should know the details of the march. We should know why it happened. And we should use this knowledge to ensure that such atrocities don't happen again. The next video will wrap up Jackson's America series and look at Jackson's legacy. But first, remember this: 4,000 people died on the Trail of Tears. They didn't have to die. They died because of government decisions. They died because one person's political goals mattered more than human lives. This is the Trail of Tears. This is what happened. This is why it matters.